A lot of you already know that I'm a colleague of Professor Kevin Warwick, who's doing our dinner speech this evening. I've been asked to remind you that if you've got questions for him, that there is a box outside to pop questions in. A lot of the research that we've done over the last 10 years has looked at how we can use implantable technologies and how in a medical context they can be applied and how we can potentially be using them for enhancement. What I want to do this morning is give a brief overview of the state of the art of implantable technologies and the sort of research that we've been doing. And this will also help put in context the talk that Kevin will do this evening. Some of the discussion that I want to have about computer viruses, I want to establish a scientific basis for some of these claims. And most importantly, and I think is a key theme of this event, is to help generate discussion on these important topics. Certainly for several years in academia, the concept of implantable technologies, the idea of a cyborg, which is a slightly loaded term anyway, have not been readily discussed, and I think that's changed quite a lot over the last few years. And I think now it's very timely to be having debate about what the future may hold as far as implantable computers, implantable technologies are concerned, and how we may use them. My background is as an engineer turned neuroscientist. Some of the things I'm going to be talking about, there are some moral, ethical questions. What I want to be talking about today is pretty much setting the scene. I don't necessarily want to be defending anything as perhaps being right or wrong or moral or ethical. Certainly these questions are very important, but from what I want to be talking about today is very much setting the scene as far as the technology is concerned. So to put it in a little bit of context and how we view the use of this type of technology, implantable devices, technology which we can actually put in the human body, there are perhaps four main categories that we can be looking at. Restorative, restoring lost functions, things like prosthetic limbs, that sort of application of technology has come a long way in the last few years, and obviously this is a very valuable use of implantable technologies and this sort of technology development. Normalizing and reconfiguring perhaps are slightly less familiar, but essentially what we're trying to do is nothing more than re-establish a human body to perform in ways which we find normal, which we wouldn't necessarily recognize as being particularly strange to us. Looking at enhancing is a little bit more of a grey area. Certainly there's a lot of overlap between these four categories, and when we consider enhancing, it may be that we end up enhancing people while we're trying to perhaps restore lost function. It may be that we take a healthy individual and apply technology in order to enhance them in some way. That may be some application of the technology that we're interested in. So if potentially we could have a brain implant which increased our memory or increased our IQ, if it's possible, would people be interested in applying technology in that way? Certainly in the last few years there's been a lot more discussion and interaction which has crossed disciplines, and certainly we're beginning to realise that having interdisciplinary discussion is of enormous value. Also in the technical development arena, we're looking at taking set disciplines like nanotechnology, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and looking at how these actually really overlap and how using combinations of these different streams and threads of technology development under the heading emerging technologies, perhaps we can find how these technologies can be applied in the ways that we think they may be, certainly for enhancing. So ICT implants, information communicating technology implants, it's a little bit of a European piece of terminology, I guess. they've been discussed for some time in various contexts. Certainly for a very long time, in the last few years, if you did a search online for ICT implants, there's really two topics that come up: the ethics of ICT implants and RFID devices. That tends to be the core themes that people talk very passionately about. Now, this is obviously very interesting, but there's more to implantable devices than just RFID. However, it has raised the question, are people interested in implanting RFID devices? Now, we know that people are. We know we have Amel here, who I think this is a picture that I've stolen from him that he'll probably show and talk about a bit later, but people are implanting RFID tag devices for a variety of reasons, and Amel will come on and discuss that a little bit later. So we know that people are willingly implanting this type of technology. Well, okay, a lot of people may say, well, some people may want it, some people may want to implant RFID devices, that's all very interesting, but actually I don't want one, that's not really for me. And that's very valid. What we may find is the use of RFID tag technology applied to other types of implantable devices. So, for example, artificial joints could have an RFID tag attached to them so that the manufacturer or date of manufacturer or some information can be read wirelessly about the implanted device once it's in a person. So we may actually find there are some contexts in which people end up with RFID devices inside them anyway, perhaps potentially not knowingly. Of more interest from our perspective are the use of active medical devices. We had a very interesting talk yesterday about different types of active medical devices and how they're used in a variety of applications, and this is perhaps some of the more familiar ones. Heart pacemakers and cochlear implants have become very common. And it's a type of implantable technology. These are forming very intimate links between technology and the human body. The type of implantable technologies that we're particularly interested in are ones that can interface with the human nervous system. So can we find a way of interfacing with the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system in order to, for example, in this particular application, we're looking at controlling a prosthetic limb. So what we have is someone who's lost the majority of their arm. However, the peripheral nerve is still in the stump of the arm, and what we want to be able to do is interface to that in some way so that we can give a more natural control of the prosthetic limb. Equally, if we can read information off the peripheral nerve, can we put information back on? Can we stimulate the peripheral nerve in order to return information, to send information to the patient as well? So, in this particular application, we're looking at two different ways of controlling aspects of this limb. The first one, you can probably see around the chest area. There's some tensing of the muscle in the chest, and we're actually using the muscle in order to generate a control signal in order to move the grip of the arm. But we're also trying to generate information on the existing peripheral nervous system that we can read off and use to control the arm in a simple way as well. So this technology is still in development. It's still a long way from finding applications which perhaps we'll be able to deploy for people not in a clinical setting. Obviously this is very much in a laboratory setting, but this is the sort of development of the technology that we're particularly interested in. And again, it's forming very intimate links between the body, the nervous system and the technology. So this particular application, we're looking at arrays of electrodes. So we have at the top on the UK 5p coin is a small array of electrodes, a microelectrode array. What you'll probably just about be able to see, the little highlighted bits are the active electrode part of the device. So essentially it's an array of needles. And what we want to do is fire that into the nervous system in order to make intimate, very low-level connections between the neural structures and the silicon, the technology. The video I'm about to show is some of the work that we did with Professor Warwick. Professor Warwick is debatably a healthy, normal person who doesn't actually need a microelectrode array. He hasn't lost an arm, he's got perfect use of his hands, but what we're interested in is developing the technology and finding ways in which we can interface to the nervous system. So we've taken one of these microelectrode arrays. The bottom picture is from the surgery where a neurosurgeon has actually cut down into the wrist, down to the median nerve, exposed the median nerve, dissected down to the nerve fascicles, and then taken the electrode array and pneumatically fired it into the nerve fibres. Then what we've done is tunnelled all the way under the arm up to about here, run a cable up, and then you can just see at the base of the arm a small circuit board, a small printed circuit board that allows us to connect a computer or some sort of recording devices to the array. So what we're seeing here, again, what we're trying to do is record information off the peripheral nervous system. Now, fortunately for everyone, I've muted it, so you won't be able to hear Kevin talk. That'll be something to look forward to this evening. But what we're trying to do is take this neural information and turn that into a control signal for this prosthetic hand. So first of all, you can see how it successfully doesn't work a couple of times. But then we've got the control of the hand. When Kevin closes his hand, we can read the neural information that's sent down the peripheral nerve to control the muscles in his hand, and use that to control the prosthetic hand. Equally, what we would like to do is take information from sensors on the prosthetic hand and stimulate the nerve fibres. So we can actually, these hands have slip sensors in the fingertips. We can record information from there and use that to stimulate the peripheral nervous system in order to give some sort of sensation back to the user. Now, when we've formed an interface, when we're reading the information off the nervous system, obviously what we do with that information is really up to us. So we had one example of controlling a prosthetic hand. In this example, we're using a computer menu system. So essentially, a double tap is like doing a double click on a mouse in order to work a way through a menu system on a computer. So what he's trying to do here is work down to an option which enables him to turn the lamp on. So hopefully he should be able to double click, and as if by magic, turn the lamp on. So all we're doing is taking this neural information and deriving control signals from it. And here is just another application. We're looking at controlling a wheelchair. So using a very simple state machine, we can use the double click type arrangement. But interestingly, we've taken this out of the laboratory environment. So we have a system which is completely mobile at this point. So what you should be able to see on his wrist is the electronics which is used in order to derive the control signal in order to control the chair. So this is very interesting. Interfaces to the peripheral nervous system obviously has applications in many areas. What we're also particularly interested in is interfacing to the central nervous system. So can we actually interface to the brain? There have been a few research groups around the world who have done this in various forms. This is unless you can read Korean, you won't understand exactly who he is or where he's from, but this is a group from America who's looking at creating invasive connections to the brains of rats. And what they want to be able to do is essentially remote control a rat, which I'm not entirely sure why you would want to remote control a rat, short of being probably the best Christmas present you could give to someone, I think. So what they're trying to do is actually stimulate the reward part of the brain in the rat in order to convince it to go left or right round a maze. And as you can see, this is all done wirelessly, so it's a very simple stimulator unit connected to a radio link, which enables them to essentially control the rat, control the movements of the rat. So here the rat wanted to turn in one direction. By stimulating a reward centre in the brain, the rat can be convinced to go the other way. Now, creating interfaces to rat brains, okay, a very interesting study, but how can we apply this sort of knowledge, this sort of technology in the context of humans? Well, what we're particularly interested in, and this little sketch of the guy shows it quite clearly, is invasive deep brain stimulation. And we talked about it a little bit yesterday. What we actually want to do is put electrodes into the centre of the brain of a Parkinson's patient in order to control debilitating tremors. Now, this type of procedure is particularly invasive. However, it's becoming particularly common, and there was some discussion yesterday about whether this type of procedure was particularly safe. The group that we work with at the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford in the UK implant 2 to 3 of these brain stimulators every week. So probably the most limiting factor is the fact that it's particularly expensive. It's around £10,000, so maybe that's 15,000 Australian dollars, I think, at a guess, something like that. But it's a particularly expensive procedure to do. So that tends to be the limiting factor more than the fact that it's considered a dangerous procedure. So we have the electrodes that are planted into the centre of the brain, a lead which comes out and goes down to a pacemaker which sits in the chest. And essentially what we're trying to do is stimulate part of the brain in order to stop it from misfunctioning. Essentially it stops it from functioning at all. Now there's been a lot of discussion about deep brain stimulation, and I'm sure we'll probably hear more about it today and tomorrow. But I think until you actually see the effect that deep brain stimulation can have, it's very difficult to appreciate how fundamental it can affect a person who has a debilitating disease like Parkinson's, for example. So this is a patient from Belgium who has a series of disorders which essentially stop him from being able to control his body. So this is as good as he can get at trying to walk on his own. So really he can't do very much without assistance. Now what we can also see here is the involuntary tremor that he has. Now the technician is going to turn on one of the deep brain stimulator units. This patient actually has 2 of them. So once he's turned on the left hand side stimulator, what we should be able to see is the tremor on his right hand side stops. You can still see a slight tremor on the left hand side of his body. So the technician turns on the other stimulator. Now not only does it get rid of the tremor, but it also has a completely fundamental effect on the patient and his ability to move. So what he'll do is go through a couple of examples. He's following another technician. So we can see he's gone from really not being able to control his body at all to being able to do fairly fine manipulation of his fingers. And the same on the other hand. But perhaps more impressive is the fact that now he can actually get up and walk. So by stimulating core parts of the brain which are essentially misfunctioning, by stimulating them and stopping them from misfiring and limiting the amount of control he has over his body, we can actually give him back the freedom to move, the freedom to basically give him back his life, is what a lot of the patients say. They've gone from really not being able to do anything to being able to do interact normally in life again. Now this opens up some interesting possibilities for us, because we're essentially putting electrodes into the centre of the brain. What we're doing is stimulating in order to stop that part of the brain misfunctioning, but equally we can be recording from these parts of the brain as well. So here's a couple of recordings from the electrodes in the centre of the brain. So this essentially shows the brain activity where the stimulating electrodes are located. So at the moment, for these recordings, they're not stimulating. What we're interested in doing is looking at very characteristic behaviours in this brain activity to see whether we can actually determine what the brain, that part of the brain, is doing at that time in order to work out whether stimulation is actually necessary or not. Part of the problem with deep brain stimulation is it stimulates the brain all the time. There's two problems with that. One, that part of the brain can't function properly at all, and also the battery unit in the deep brain stimulator itself eventually wears out and needs to be replaced, and this is in part why this is such an expensive procedure. So what we're essentially looking at doing is closing the loop, bi-directional communication with the brain, and I think this is a particularly interesting technology. And it's also interesting to think how we may be able to apply this technology to other parts of the brain for other applications. Now, part of what I want to talk about today is computer viruses. Much like AML, I have an RFID tag that's implanted in my hand. Obviously you can't quite see it, but it's around about here. And we use that for a variety of applications that I think AML will come on a bit later and talk about very similar applications, so I won't go into them too much. But essentially we're interested in looking at what the capabilities of this type of technology are. Now when we talk about RFID, and this is essentially an RFID tag, we usually think about the type of tags that we're putting into pets, an identifier. Really this technology has come a long way in the last 10, 15 years, and these very simple devices have become a lot more complex and a lot more capable. Essentially we're reaching the stage where we need to be viewing them more as extremely simple computers more than simple identifiers. They can store information, manipulate information, even do very simple computations. So what can we actually be using these devices for, and when we're implanting them, what sort of risks are associated with it? Well, we're going to get marginally technical, but essentially what we're trying to do here is show that these type of devices are susceptible to computer viruses. They've reached the stage where rather than being an identifier, we can actually use them as part of a complex system. So in this particular case we're using it for secure access into a building, and the security profile for each person is actually stored on the tag. Now the problem with that is that we have a central database which stores the profile and updates the profiles, loads it onto the tag when they pass a reader in order to update them if they need updating, and that allows the user to go into another building with certain security privileges, even if that centralized database isn't linked to that building. Now what we've proved is a very simple example of an SQL injection exploit for this particular system. So in two experiments we've corrupted the main computer system in the building, which means essentially it tries to load a virus, a copy of the malicious code, to the implants every time the user walks past one of the readers. And this means that the virus can be loaded onto the tag and then carried off and potentially used to infect another building that uses the same system. Equally, we've done an experiment just loading the malicious code onto the tag, which means when the user walks past one of the readers in the building, the code is read off and is used to infect the database. So here, if we look at how the database looks in its normal state, and after an infected tag has been taken past one of the readers, we can see the malicious piece of code has appeared in each of these entries in the database. So this is a sample of 4 different tags. So we've shown that the virus can actually be loaded into the tag, spread to the system. Once it's in the system in this way, it can potentially then go on and infect other tags. Most people in our building actually use RFID cards rather than RFID implants, I probably should point out. But the same thing is possible. Now, why is this particularly important? Why does this particularly matter, and how does this relate to people being infected with computer viruses, when surely we're talking about just a lump of technology? Certainly some of the criticism that we've heard about this type of application or this type of demonstration is that essentially we could have taken an RFID tag on the bench and shown, yes, we can copy a virus to it, we can use that to infect a computer system. What we're particularly interested in is how, when people have technology implanted in their body, their actual concept of their body can change over time. People with pacemakers and cochlear implants over time consider the technology to actually be part of them, to be part of what they perceive to be their body. And I think this is very important, because at that stage we can start talking about attacks to the technology being an attack to the body of the person. Now, it's quite difficult to explain the sort of feeling that you get even in a simple application like the virus that we've done under very controlled conditions, a very simple demonstration. It's actually a surprisingly violating experience to have a tag which I've had for just over a year, that I use for a variety of applications, to suddenly not be able to use it for those applications, and in fact feel like if I walk through a building I can be wirelessly transmitting this malicious code. It's not like I can take the tag out and put it on the desk and leave it alone and come back to it and fix it when I have time or have the capability, or swap it to one that doesn't have malicious code in it. This is a piece of technology that's intimately connected to the body. And I think this is very important, especially in the context of medical devices, and potentially if we look in the future at a point of convergence where perhaps we take the type of technology, the simple RFID technologies and the more complex medical technologies, and see where in the future they may converge and we start applying medical technologies in the context of enhancement. I think there's a few very interesting points to take away from this. Certainly the idea of enhancement, a lot of people still think, well, this really is, we're talking science fiction. I think in the context of medical devices and the capabilities that these medical devices are having, and the potential that we have for reapplying them in a different context, I don't think that we can simply just dismiss enhancement. Equally, when we're looking at something like a normalizing technology like a prosthetic limb or a deep brain stimulation unit, we may actually find that while we're trying to normalize the person, while we're trying to just return some function, we may actually be giving them a capability which is more enhanced than our normal human capability. So, for example, there was I forget what his name was now, but the Olympic athlete who wanted to compete with his prosthetic legs, and it was actually deemed that probably that was inappropriate because there was an advantage to using that type of device over a standard athlete. Equally, we found with deep brain stimulation, there have been some reports of side effects whereby the person who's being treated in one particular case for Tourette's, as a side effect actually felt like that they'd become more creative. So using one specific electrode on the deep brain stimulator device, they can actually become more creative, and this was in part corroborated by their employer, and they worked as a graphic designer. So there are potentially these other applications, although there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done to verify these claims. I think the idea that applying this type of technology for enhancement clearly can't be easily dismissed. As we look to the advantages of using this technology, we have to look at the risks as well. What we've shown with the computer virus is an extremely simple example. What we're trying to do is put a milestone for saying implantable technologies have reached a certain stage where we need to be considering these risks. Certainly with medical technologies, we tend to find that the security aspects really aren't considered at all at the moment. It's the functional aspects that are important. So we tend to find that a lot of devices like pacemakers can be communicated with wirelessly in order to configure them, take logged data out of them, but there's actually no security protocol. There's, in some cases, if you have the right type of reader, you can just communicate directly with the device. So we need to start factoring in these security aspects as well. And equally, we need to start thinking about what implanting technology in the body actually means for the person. I don't think we can take the person out of the system, as a lot of people are implying when they analyse this sort of thing purely from a technical perspective. If we take the person out of the system, then really we're entirely missing the whole point of what it means for us to, how it changes us as a person, how it changes us as people when we have implanted technology. And I think that's a very important aspect. Now, it is very difficult to explain, and I don't know whether Amel will approach this topic or not, but difficult to explain the feeling that you have when you have a piece of implanted technology. But it is difficult to express. I guess it's a bit like if you've ever had your house burgled and you have that really horrible feeling in the bottom of your stomach. It's very difficult to explain to someone who hasn't had their house burgled what that type of feeling is, and it's very easy to dismiss it. Well, you've been burgled, so you've lost some stuff. Well, actually it's more than that, and if we try and extract the person out of the system in that way, then we're really missing a fundamental part of this. Okay, I shall stop there. Thank you very much.
So we have time for questions. Well, I'll take the introducer's privilege and say you've talked quite a bit both about the technical details and about the affective aspects of how we're dealing with this. As an expert in the area, how do you think we should avoid the kinds of dangers, the security dangers you've talked about? Do you think wireless inside is a good idea?
Yeah, I think implantable technologies, they're here. I think in part of the problem is that a lot of people still see them as science fiction, but actually in a medical context they're very complex devices which connect in a very intimate way with the body. What we need to be doing is looking at the bigger picture, and the bigger picture is, well, okay, there are potential security aspects that need to be addressed as well, and it is not impossible to address these, it's just that they're largely forgotten, because at the moment nobody wants to do a denial of service attack against a pacemaker or something like that. But it's potentially possible, and as these devices become more complicated, then more risks are going to present themselves. So at that stage we just need to be factoring in these elements as well.
Just in terms of human enhancement, do you think as the technology progresses and there's, as I know you mentioned the choice aspect, do you think as time goes on and more people would take up the technologies for human enhancement, can I just get your comment on what you think the situation would be with the haves and the have-nots?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. Just to recap the question, essentially I think the question is, as more and more people adopt the technology, there's going to be people that can afford it and do adopt it, and the people that can't afford it or don't want to adopt it, and there will be a divide between people in that way. I could answer the question by asking who here does not have a mobile phone. Yeah, 2. I didn't want a mobile phone when they first came out, and eventually the social pressures were such that I just became the idiot that didn't have a mobile phone, and in the end I got one. I think social pressures in that way are a big drive behind the adoption of this type of technology. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that that's right, or that that's how it should be, but I think it's a very valid point that as we look to see how people have benefited from technology in certain ways, then there are going to be these pressures to get people to adopt the technology, to get people to use the technology in that sort of way. So I think there are some very important discussions that need to be had exactly about these points.
Hi, Matt. Judith from Boston Institute of Technology. Hi, I have overlooked suspected cataract, so I have implants in my eye. Am I biologically enhanced then, in your opinion?
I think the point at which I had an interesting interview I did yesterday, and I was asked, am I a cyborg because I've had an RFID chip implanted? Well, good question. I think it's very difficult to say at what point someone is bionically enhanced and what point it's not. I think it's not black and white, and in part this is the problem. When we look at saying, for example, enhancement is not acceptable and we will not allow it. Well, at what point is it enhancement? You could say wearing glasses is a form of enhancement in some respect. It's really difficult to say this is bionic enhancement, this is not. And I think exactly because of those grey areas, this is why the debate is very interesting and the problems are very real.
This is a French philosopher, Jean-Luc Nancy, who wrote a book called The Foreigner. He made a change of his heart, got the heart from another person. And so, it's not a question, more a comment. How far can we describe this objectively, and how far can this experience of the foreigner, either technology foreigner, in this case, or a natural foreigner, which is another organ, how far can we describe only the first person? Because it's foreigner in myself. And how far are we dependent on such descriptions in the first person? But my question is, have you done something in this regard to compare, but just to ask people to describe subjectively the experiences of the foreigner in yourself, in the other self, and what would be the difference between, I could say, a natural foreigner and a technological foreigner? If I understood you correctly, the technological foreigner can be addressed from the outside. The natural foreigner, as far as I know, it is just part of your identity. At the same time, there is a difference. So, how do you see this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting discussion. It goes back a little bit to what I was saying before about how people actually perceive themselves and how they perceive their body when a piece of technology is implanted, and whether, if they incorporate the technology into what they perceive to be their body, this also has implications when we look at fundamental human rights which protect the body, and extending these in order to protect the technology as well. I think this is a really interesting discussion, and it's largely missed by the engineers and the computer scientists that look in a very blinkered way at this type of application and say, well, okay, you could have done exactly the same with the things on the desk. To entirely eliminate the person from the equation is misguided, and it's wrong. I don't know that there's been a great body of research that's been done at the moment about how people's perceptions change over time with this type of technology implant. Certainly medical devices have been used for some time, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's been initial research in this area. But I think it's an extremely interesting area that does need to be researched, because I think it does have further implications from certainly a legal aspect and very many other aspects as well.
I wonder if you have a view on the extropian and or transhumanist movement.
Do I have a view on the transhumanist movement? Yes, I do.
Would you care to mention something about your views?
Well, I think what we have to consider is when we're looking at enhancing people in this way, then we are looking at essentially an evolution in what it is to be human. And I think adoption of technology in this way really is our next evolutionary step. So a lot of people have discussed how we will change in fundamental ways and how these changes will be driven largely by technology. So I agree to a large part that these changes are inevitable, and certainly the type of technologies that we're developing for medical applications have clear application in other areas. So from a fairly superficial, do I agree that it's a discussion worth having, and do I agree that there is some logic and good reasoning behind it, then yeah, I certainly do.
I think we should thank our speaker, and we can continue this conversation.